Welcome back to our channel. Hidden in your pocket? A 1975 No-S Roosevelt Dime sold for $506,000, and a 1999 broad-struck dime hit $10K. Is your dime worth more than 10 cents? Like and subscribe to uncover secret dime treasures. In 1984, the U.S. Mint found itself facing the kind of pressure that only decades of growing demand and strained resources could bring. The Roosevelt dime had already been a familiar sight for nearly 40 years, its copper-nickel-clad surface now fully replacing the once silver coins of earlier generations. The economy was steady, but coin production continued to increase as the population and commerce expanded, and mints in Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco were working at breakneck speed. In Philadelphia alone, millions of dimes rolled off the presses each day, each one struck in a split second, inspected by eye and machine before moving on to the next stage. For all that precision, the volume meant mistakes could slip through. And in one quiet corner of the mint that year, a small handful of coins emerged that didn't quite fit. They bore all the markings of a 1984 Roosevelt dime. Franklin Roosevelt's sharp profile, the torch, olive branch, and oak branch on the reverse. But they were subtly different. Years later, in a small town in Oregon, a collector named Laura McKinley was sitting at her kitchen table, a magnifying loupe pressed to her eye, sifting through another jar of pocket change from a local antique shop. Laura had been collecting coins since her grandfather gave her a Whitman folder as a child. Her passion leaned toward silver dimes and unusual errors, and she developed a reputation in her small coin club for having an uncanny eye. That evening the jar had yielded nothing of note, until a dime toward the bottom caught her attention. At first glance it was like any other. Dated 1984, minted in Philadelphia, lightly circulated but not abused. She was about to toss it into her pile of duplicates when she noticed something strange about the lettering on the reverse. It looked doubled. Not just a shadow, but clear, distinct, raised impressions echoing the word United States of America, with Liberty on the obverse appearing similarly ghosted. Turning the dime under the light, she caught faint doubling on the torch as well. Her hands went still as she leaned closer, her breath shallow. This wasn't the usual kind of doubling caused by machine vibration, a common minor defect collectors called machine doubling. This looked sharper, truer, as though the die itself had been slightly rotated between strikes. That night Laura barely slept. She compared it to every known double die example in her library of reference books, scrutinized online forums, even called a mentor on the East Coast for his thoughts. "Send it in," he told her after hearing her describe it. "If it's what you think it is, you're sitting on something very rare." She mailed it to a grading service the next morning, her heart pounding as she packed it securely. Weeks passed in anxious silence before the package returned. The accompanying certificate confirmed what she suspected. It was an authentic 1984 double die dime. What stunned her was the note attached. Only a handful of such examples had been verified, and this one showed stronger doubling than most. The graders had given it a choice uncirculated grade. For the next year Laura watched the market closely. At first she told no one, afraid that revealing her find might lower her leverage. Then she began quietly talking to dealers and collectors she trusted, asking what they thought it might fetch at auction. Early estimates were cautious. Error coins from the 1980s hadn't yet reached the fever pitch of earlier decades. Still, whispers in the collecting community grew louder as word of her find circulated. By the late 1990s, other examples of the 1984 double die had begun to surface, though none quite as dramatic as Laura's. Prices crept upward as collectors who specialized in error coins began snapping them up. What had once been dismissed as a curiosity now demanded real attention. The more collectors appreciated the rarity and sharpness of the doubling on Laura's dime, the more offers she began receiving. Offers that climbed from hundreds into the thousands. She held off, knowing she was watching the early stages of something bigger. The coin's value continued its erratic climb over the years, reflecting a growing fascination with mint errors among a new generation of collectors. By 2010, double die errors across all denominations had seen spikes at major auctions, and Laura's 1984 dime, still in her possession, was now regularly referenced in articles and auction previews as the benchmark for the variety. Each time another came to light, bidding wars ensued, sometimes doubling previous sales records. But none quite matched the sharpness and grade of hers. In 2017, Laura received a surprising email from a numismatist who'd been researching mint records from 1984. His findings added a layer of mystery and excitement to the story. Apparently, during that year, the Philadelphia Mint had experimented briefly with some slightly adjusted die settings to improve detail, but one set of dies was misaligned during setup and used for a short production run before being corrected. Official records didn't mention the double die error, but internal memos hinted at a temporary aberration in the dime line, which explained why so few had been struck and why they exhibited such pronounced doubling. When she finally decided to consign it to auction in 2021, the buildup was palpable. Collectors across the country knew her dime by reputation, and the auction house featured it prominently in their catalog, calling it the strongest known example of the 1984 double die Roosevelt dime. That night, she sat in her living room as bids flashed across the screen. Her fingers clenched in anticipation as the numbers climbed higher and higher, well beyond even her most optimistic projections. And then, as the final gavel fell, the result left even seasoned collectors stunned. Laura's 1984 double die Roosevelt dime sold for a breathtaking figure between $48,000 and $124,000, depending on which buyer added the premium fees. The error that had escaped unnoticed from the mint's massive machinery had become one of the most sought-after pieces of its kind. A perfect storm of historical accident, collector passion, and market timing that turned an ordinary dime into a legend. In 2006, the United States Mint was operating at peak efficiency. The Roosevelt dime, still the smallest and lightest circulating coin in the American currency system, had long since transitioned fully to its copper-nickel-clad composition. Nearly 60 years after its introduction, the dime remained a staple of commerce, quietly moving through cash registers, pockets, and banks without much notice. The Denver and Philadelphia mints churned them out by the millions every day, their presses fine-tuned to strike hundreds of coins per minute. But even with all the precision and technology, there are moments when perfection slips. Hidden within those countless millions struck that year were a few coins that bore a flaw, small enough to pass by most eyes, but dramatic enough to change its fate entirely. For Matthew Rowan, a young collector in Minnesota, the thrill of numismatics was about the hunt. He had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories of finding silver dimes and wheat pennies in pocket change back in the 50s and 60s. In his 20s, Matthew had taken to combing through rolls of coins from his local bank, sometimes spending entire evenings at his kitchen table under a bright lamp. One Saturday morning, he picked up 2 boxes of dimes, 5,000 coins to sort. Hours into the task, with his eyes growing weary and his patience tested, he rolled another dull-looking dime between his fingers. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable. The year 2006 glinted under the bulb, a Philadelphia Mint mark clearly stamped. He was about to set it aside when the torch on the reverse caught the light at just the right angle. The flame looked wrong. Not blurred or worn, but doubled. He held it closer, squinting. The letters United States of America seemed to echo faintly, as though stamped twice. He flipped it over. Liberty and I in God We Trust showed the same strange doubling. His pulse quickened. Machine doubling was common, almost worthless to collectors. But this didn't look like machine doubling. The lines were strong, sharp, well-defined. It was as though the die itself had shifted slightly between strikes. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his loop. He spent the next hour examining the coin from every angle, comparing it to ordinary 2006 dimes he'd already sorted. The more he looked, the more convinced he became. The doubling was dramatic and unmistakable. He photographed the coin and posted the images on a collector's forum he frequented. Responses trickled in over the next day, cautious but encouraging. A couple of experienced collectors chimed in, suggesting it could be a double die and urging him to have it authenticated. He sent it to a grading service the following week, carefully packaging it to avoid even the slightest damage. The wait was agonizing. When the package finally came back, he tore it open and stared at the certificate. It confirmed his hopes. A genuine 2006 double die Roosevelt dime, strong doubling visible on both obverse and reverse. The graders had even assigned it a surprisingly high grade, noting its excellent condition despite its circulation. Matthew felt as though he'd uncovered a hidden treasure no one else had noticed. At first, he kept the news to himself, reluctant to sell too soon. But he began following auction prices for other modern era coins. noting how prices fluctuated wildly depending on rarity and demand. Initially, offers from dealers came in low, with some skeptical about its long-term value. But a few specialized collectors expressed strong interest, hinting that modern double-die dimes were becoming harder to find in such condition. Over the next few years, word of Matthew's find circulated among collectors. A handful of other 2006 double-die examples were discovered, but none as crisp or dramatic. Error coin enthusiasts began citing his coin in blogs and articles as one of the sharpest known examples of its kind. Auction results for similar errors in other years began to rise, fueling growing confidence in modern varieties. In 2015, a collector of modern mint errors approached Matthew with an offer well into the five-figure range. He declined, watching prices continue to rise in subsequent years. By 2020, the value of double-die dimes from the early 2000s began to spike at major auctions, as more collectors sought to fill gaps in their Roosevelt-era collections. The market became increasingly unpredictable but undeniably stronger. One evening in 2023, Matthew received a call from an auction house specializing in rare U.S. coins. They were preparing an event focused on modern mint errors and had heard about his dime. Would he consider consigning it? After some deliberation, he agreed, sending it off with a mix of anticipation and nerves. On the night of the auction, Matthew sat in his living room, watching the bids climb higher with each passing second. The crowd of bidders, both in the room and online, seemed eager, pushing the price further than even he expected. When the final bid was accepted, the room erupted in applause. The gavel fell, and the 2006 double-die Roosevelt dime sold for a staggering figure, securing a place in modern numismatic history with a final value somewhere between $36,000 and $108,000.